Hello. Welcome. As most of you know, but maybe not all, my name is Jane Dawson. I'm the Virginia Eason-Weinman 51 Professor of Environmental Studies and Government, and I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's Jean Thomas Lambert Endowed Lecture. Tonight's speaker, Jim Puckett, is an individual who has made a tremendous contribution to our understanding and knowledge of international flow of hazardous waste and materials. But he's played an especially important role in opening our eyes to the environmental, social, and economic horrors that have accompanied the disposal and so-called recycling of our electronic gadgets and computers, that is, e-waste. Prior to 2002, some may have suspected that the electronics dropped off at a local recycling center for appropriate recycling, dismantling, disposal were in fact not staying in the U.S. and instead being shipped abroad, but maybe even going to poorer countries whose capacity to handle this high-tech recycling task might be severely lacking. However, it was Jim Puckett's investigatory work with the hazardous waste watchdog group, the Basel Action Network, that really brought these images and knowledge home to us. The short film, Exporting Harm, which I think most of you have seen at this point, stunned its audiences with the reality of the damage our e-waste is doing to impoverished communities in China and other parts of Asia. And most of us have never been able to think about electronics recycling in the same trusting way we did before. Jim Puckett is the executive director of the Basel Action Network, having spent his career working as an environmental health and justice activist. Prior to his work with BAN, Mr. Puckett was the toxics director for Greenpeace International, based in Netherlands, and he's campaigned tirelessly for stronger international treaties restricting or banning trade in any kind of hazardous waste, including e-waste. He was one of the founders of the Basel Action Network in 1997. He's participated in meetings on the Basel Action or Basel Treaty as an official representative of civil society since the treaty's inception in 1989. He's here to offer us an update on what is now happening in the wake of our growing knowledge of e-waste export injustices and the extent to which the Basel Treaty is successfully shutting down flows of toxic waste to developing and less developed societies. His talk today, whose title does not fill me with great optimism, is on the high-tech trashing of the global south. So please join me in welcoming Jim Puckett to Connecticut College.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the organizers and the Goodwin Nearing Center. This is quite an honor to come here. I've never been to Connecticut College, and I really appreciate the invitation very much. I'll try to be positive. Certainly we need to look at what is and what has not changed, but we will in the night with some solutions and some going forward, and I really hope a lot of good questions. So the Basel Action Network is a tiny little group based in Seattle, but we have a big voice, and we carry a big role in the world, we believe. Our mission is to prevent the globalization of the hazardous chemical crisis. What does that mean? Preventing toxic trade. And I'm going to talk about that in terms of the externalization of risk and costs to developing countries. We promote a toxics-free future through green design and minimizing consumption. And we promote global environmental justice where all have a right to a pollution-free environment. We have a website, and we have a blog. Really easy to remember, ban.org. There's a wealth of information, academic and otherwise, news stories on this topic. You can access our films, etc., from here. So as I said, I'm from Seattle, and I'm going to show you two pictures that were taken in Seattle, two extraordinary pictures that I took myself and I witnessed myself, taken 10 years apart. This one way back in the ministerial session of the WTO. It was called the Battle of Seattle. And you've never seen so many people dressed up like sea turtles in your life, and so many people protesting. both violently and non-violently. So much tear gas in an American city, you would not believe what this was like. What was all the fuss about? Well, we'll talk about that. Another picture taken in 2009. Some college had the bright idea, we'll have an Earth Day event and collect all the e-waste we can garner from the public, and everybody will be happy because they'll be helping the Earth. And this event shut down half of the city. It took place on a weekend, and all the streets were clogged. Everybody had something to give for free to the great cause of saving humanity through e-waste deposits. You should really watch out for these kind of free events. We had to spend the next months making sure this guy didn't export it all, because that was his plan, and he unfortunately didn't make any money after we were done with him. But the linkage between those two pictures, those two crazy pictures taken in my city, is, well, I'm going to give it away here. It's all about cost externalization. And how many of you have ever heard of cost externalization? Have you taken an economics class? Very good. The issue I have with economics classes is that they don't spend all of their time talking about cost externalization, but it's a little footnote in a chapter in Economics 101. But the more I look at the world, the more I realize that cost externalities are why this world doesn't tick. It's why we have almost every problem you can imagine. It really should have volumes written about it. And yet it's just a little idea, a little aberration that economists like to talk about occasionally. History of pollution is one of cost externalization. And for those of you that are music majors, what cost externalization is all about, it sounds really highfalutin, but it's not. It's a market distortion where a cost resulting from an action or business negatively impacts nature or other persons without that original actor ever paying the price to compensate or prevent the negative impact. Throughout history, those that extract resources, use these resources, and discharge waste pollutants have not had to pay or charge the true price that reflects the real costs of their activities. Let's take an example. You go down to Trader Joe's. You guys have Trader Joe's in Connecticut? No. No, not here anyway. Okay, this is a market which, like so many now, is getting very trendy because they bring stuff from all over the world. And they package it up and they sell it very cheap. Well, it could be mini markets, but this is a Trader Joe's shrimp bag. Everybody loves shrimp. I love shrimp. Let's say this bag costs about $8.99. Are we paying for the loss of mangroves, natural fisheries habitat, biodiversity, livelihood of fishers? Because almost all this shrimp nowadays is farmed on former mangrove wetlands, forests that are decimated so that we can eat this lovely shrimp. What is that biodiversity worth? How much should we have paid for it? What about the use of the pesticides they use in those fish farms? They affect our health, they affect the ecosystem. What about the labor conditions? The long hours, lack of sanitation, lack of health care, lack of workers' rights. Those are also ways that costs are externalized. Who's paying those prices? And then we have to ship it all the way from maybe Thailand, Bangladesh, wherever it's coming from. Mangrove forests are being decimated and turned into shrimp farms everywhere. That shipping, that burning of fuel and transport, who pays that cost? And the climate change impacts. So, how much was that $8.99 bag really worth? $40? $80? $1,000? If they really had to pay the true price. So cost externalized is a big deal. I would posit that externalized costs vastly outnumber or outweigh internalized costs. Almost every product we have, we're paying far less than if you added up all the externalities, it would be more than twice that amount. So it really is a distorted world, and it's not an aberration. It happens with everything. We're not paying true price. We're not paying real cost economics. So with waste management, this plays out in this way. In the course of history, the first factories in the industrial age, they would put their waste out the back door, and a lot of times they'd just burn it out in the backyard. Well, the neighbors didn't like that. They said, no, you should internalize that. You should deal with it yourself. So what did the factory do? They built this really tall stack because the neighbors were complaining, and they pushed the smoke out above the neighbors so you wouldn't smell it, and that's why we have all these relic smokestacks, because that was the brilliant way to get rid of pollution in the turn of the century. Then, so we had people that thought, well, we got some rivers here, that's a really easy way to get rid of stuff, sewage, etc., flows, let's just put it into the river. We even had a time where ocean dumping was quite common. This was like the new place, the new hidey hole for waste. And ocean dumping was actually seen as the solution to all our pollution. Finding others or the global commons to pay for real costs and damage. That's been the game since the beginning of the industrial age, and we've got to change that. So how do you change it? Well, one thing that happened, of course, is that we had internalization through regulation, and this happened first in developed countries, and they started saying, no, you can't do that. Public nuisance laws ban this type of dumping. Clean Air Act banned this. Clean Water Act banned this. London Convention banned this. All the time the price of disposal of waste is going up. As we're internalizing the costs, they're having to pay more for it, so the products got more expensive. But that's led to the final externalization, the exploitation of developing countries. There we can still incur big costs and never get the bill. It's quite handy that way. So we live in a world where so much of the trade that we have, and we're not talking just about end-of-life issues in waste, we're looking at the whole life cycle. The same thing plays out over the whole life cycle. So we've got a world now where the South, the global South represented by the bottom part of this picture, is full of factories, full of extraction that's very deadly for the environment, and we ship them waste. We get the product, they get the waste. We lose the jobs, they get the poison. And that's the pretty picture we have now. So pollution follows the pathway of the greatest opportunity for cost externalization. It always has, it always will. And with the WTO, we find that our global rules for trade actually aid and abet that process. Because we have with the WTO freedom of movement of goods, sounds great, freedom of movement of services, freedom of movement of capital, but we put a big hold and lock down labor. We don't allow those terrible Africans and Asians to come here and work. That would be bad. So what we do is we're instilling little pockets of poverty and demand to do things very cheaply. And we also have no freedom of movement of regulations and standards. So if we have a great EPA, which we don't, and we have really good standards, certainly you would want to make sure that if the work went elsewhere, they would have the same standards. They wouldn't have a double standard. There wouldn't be all that opportunity for externalizing costs. But that's the world the WTO has shaped for us to date. Doesn't mean it can't be changed. But what we find is our classic economic rules reward and thus institutionalize cost externalization. And that's why that picture there is important. That's why those protests, people were starting to realize, not a good thing. Free trade, a myth. So these are some of the high priests of classical economics. And when Obama got elected, what did he do? He hired them. And he stuck with the real traditionalists. The guy on the left, his name is Larry Summers. He first was head economist at the World Bank. It's the first time I get to know him. And then he headed up our Treasury under Bill Clinton. So his name is actually on these dollar bills from that time. And then he became president of Harvard. This guy's had every classic job there is. He's been highly rewarded for his work. And then he became, with Obama, in the Economic Council in the White House. In 1991, he wrote a memo, which was infamous at the time, and I still think is quite remarkable and quite telling. In that memo, he said, "I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that." He also said, "I've always thought that underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted." Well, he later, when this thing got leaked in 1992, it got leaked out, he said, "I was being provocative, I was being sarcastic, don't you get it?" And maybe that's true, I don't think so. But even if it's true, the memo is still very telling because it really describes how traditional economists think. And Jose Lutzenberger, the Brazilian Secretary of Environment at the time, he didn't think it was sarcastic or just being provocative. He took it at its face value and he slammed back. "Your reasoning is perfectly logical but totally insane. Your thoughts provide a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionist thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in." He was not a happy camper with that memo. Right after he wrote this letter, though, he lost his job, and Larry Summers kept his and went on to greater things. But this is what this impeccable logic looks like. You have waste tobogganing from rich to poor because the costs have been internalized more in the north, in the rich countries, and it slides down that pathway of least resistance to those that can't present to you with the bill for the damage you've done. And so it does slide downhill, and it is an impeccable logic. So in the late 1980s, we saw this becoming epidemic. As the prices of disposal of waste got more and more expensive in developed countries and industrialized countries, ships, intermodal transport was just taking off, and it was very cheap to just export your waste. And there were some classic examples. The Cayenne Sea was a ship in 1986 loaded with Philadelphia incinerator ash, which went all around the world looking for a place to dump it, and that was the time that Greenpeace first got involved in this issue. And Greenpeace would put out a warning to every port where they thought the ship was going, and warning them it was full of waste, looking for a place to dump it. And it really raised the awareness tremendously. The ship had nowhere to put this material. Everywhere it went, it changed its name 3 times. It went to every continent. And finally, the captain later admitted that he disposed of the waste. This is actually a picture of half the waste that was dumped in Haiti. And the cleanup afterwards, this is the aftermath of the cleanup that finally took place. But the captain of the ship finally got rid of the other half of the waste by dumping it in the Indian Ocean, and he didn't have cranes to do it. They had to shovel it out by hand. It's the only way they got rid of it. So there was a time when there was a movement to get this waste back home in Philadelphia. Finally, many years later in the year 2000, it came back home. Another classic example was Cocoa Beach, Nigeria. This is Italian waste dumped in West Africa. Really bad waste. It was chemical waste, PCBs, dioxin-laden waste, etc. It was given to a farmer, and he said, "You can have it for $100 a month. Just let us park it there, and it's really good construction material, and you'll be happy with it." So the guy took it in for $100 a month, and he later died, and many others got sick, and finally the Italians had to take it back home. And then we had the Islip garbage barge, all these happening about the same time, the late 1980s, where this barge was loaded up with New York solid waste, garbage, went down the Caribbean, looked around, tried to dump it places. Again, they were warned off, and finally, after many, many months of cruising the Caribbean, going to Suriname, etc., it was turned back to New York. So those classic incidents raised awareness globally, and Africa was hit repeatedly by these kind of schemes. And at the time, the head of UNEP was a gentleman named Mr. Tolba, and he was from Egypt, and he said, "This is an issue for us. Africans are not going to put up with this. This is a transboundary issue. This is for the United Nations. We will make a treaty. And he announced that in 1987. Well, that treaty is called the Basel Convention, from which our group takes its name. We're a watchdog of that treaty and trying to improve it all the time. But when it was first adopted in 1989, it needed improvement badly. As is often the case with international law, when it's first formed, it's really the lowest common denominator that you get. You don't vote in international law, almost never. So any one country wants to bring the bar down, it gets down to that level. And in this case, I was there, it was the United States that brought that bar down. And they wouldn't allow any type of prohibition, really. The only prohibition it ended up having was you can't send your waste to Antarctica. But it was a start, and to the credit of the developing nations there, they took that start and really made some progress with it. Today, we have 179 countries. The world has really good saturation with this treaty. Certain countries there in red, my God, those signed the convention back in 1989, but they're the only countries that signed it that never ratified it. And one of those countries you can't see is Haiti, and the other one is Afghanistan, and I have to say, just a week ago they ratified it. So now there's only two countries left, the United States and Haiti, that were originally there at the signing, but never put it into their law. And that's just the Basel Convention, the original treaty, which I said is very minimalistic and did not make people happy. What it does do is it calls for minimization of hazardous generation by all countries, hazardous waste generation, which is a general obligation, nothing really with a lot of teeth in it. Calls for countries to be nationally self-sufficient in their hazardous waste management, very important principle. But the real guts of it was a legal regime whereby you fill out some paperwork and then you can send the waste. So the country would have to consent to receiving it. And that sounds good, but the kind of bribes and economic pressure that were being put on countries to receive waste, it was easily corruptible, and the developing countries would not accept that type of regime. They said, that's not good enough. We came here wanting a prohibition. So it failed again to prohibit anything except to Antarctica. So Greenpeace at the time, I was there, not hanging, but I was down below, put up this banner, and the African group walked out. To their credit, though, the developing countries then went regionally, and in their own regions, they started making these prohibitions. So they started locking down. The Lomé Convention is with the African, Pacific, and Caribbean nations, the agreement with the European Union. Central American countries reached an accord to not allow any import of hazardous waste. Bamako Convention, African continent said hands off to hazardous waste. They made their own treaty. Waigani in the South Pacific, and the Izmir Protocol in the Mediterranean. So by the time the next meetings of the Basel Convention came around, a proposal was floated by the Group of 77 in China to have a prohibition that was originally wanted in the original treaty, and it passed as a decision in 1994, and in 1995 they passed it as an amendment. So this would actually change the text of the treaty. And that amendment basically prohibits the export of all hazardous waste for recycling or disposal from the Annex 7 group of countries, which are considered the developed countries, and they're made up of the OECD group, the EU group, and Liechtenstein. And they're not supposed to send their waste to any country not on that list. And it's important to know there's the two motivations for this, because there are a lot of times the second one is forgotten. Obviously, the first one protects developing countries from the downstream impacts. But whenever you internalize costs, there's benefits upstream, and it provides strong incentives for implementing waste prevention and green design at source. So much more efficient to prevent problems than to mitigate problems. So much more efficient. Ounce of prevention and all that stuff. So the effect of the ban, and it does have an effect even though it's not enforced yet, would be to put up a wall, a trade barrier. an unabashed trade barrier to hazardous waste. And that's what the convention was supposed to do, but wasn't really effective at doing. And say, no, you can't do that. We're going to internalize those costs. And so many times we find that regulation is essential for internalization. And then recently, so in the interim period from that long time ago, 1995 till now, and just a few years ago in 2011, the ban had been garnering ratifications slowly but surely. But the way the convention was written, nobody knew exactly how many we needed because there was an ambiguous text. And of course, when there's an ambiguous text, the people that didn't like the ban seized upon this and said, no, 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 this can't go into force until many, many years down the road. We're going to interpret it this way. So there was a long period of impasse because the text of the convention was not clear about when amendments go into force. There was a diplomatic effort to solve that logjam, and we had a major breakthrough at the last Conference of Parties, COP, in 2011. And the result of that meeting, which was really a great celebration, a great celebratory event to finally free up the ban amendment. The result is that we just need 15 more countries for it to enter into force. So even though I did mention that even though it's not in strict legal force internationally, it's got a lot of force right now because many of the countries that it applies to, that Annex 7 group, there are 41 of those countries that are considered developed. Many of them have already put it in their national law. So basically all of Europe. 35 countries and a handful of others from other parts of the world have made it law of the land already. So those in green have already implemented 35 of them. Those that have just doing the Basel Convention, the prior informed consent paperwork regime, are 5 countries, and then a country doing neither, our country. Not ratified the Basel Convention nor the Ban Amendment. So the Ban Amendment stands, I believe, as a landmark. It's amazing that it said no to free trade at a time when free trade was starting to pick up steam. It said no to cost externalization through an international regime, and it said yes to environmental justice. It's a landmark worth hanging on to, worth preserving. So this gets us to our next picture, electronics. And why are they part of this equation? I think we all know our relationship with electronics has gotten pretty strange. I have to say, even though there are tools, and they're just amazing tools, it's really their toyness that really makes them strange. They're toys for us. This is an adult toy, it's a kid's toy, it's a teenage toy. Like we've never seen before, these are addictive toys. And consumer action on consumer electronics is unprecedented. We're in love with these things. We're in lust with them. And it has had really unforeseen effects. And I won't even get into the psychological effects, which we're all wondering about ourselves about, but just the environmental effects for the moment. So we're on this amazing growth curve, just to show the past years, between 75 and 85, we had a decade there with 110% rate of growth. So now it's suspected, if you look at this column of computers per 1,000 people, we're over the mark where there's 1 computer per person in the United States now. And of course, computers aren't the big deal anymore. We have everything else, tablets, iPhones, what have you. All of it hardware. So globally, just looking at personal computers, we're expected to have 2 billion by 2015, because this growth curve that you see is playing out now in every continent. US was at the beginning of it, but you'll see the same growth curve taking off in Africa, certainly in China and Asia, certainly in Latin America. They're just a little behind. So this rate, this astonishing rate of consumption of this type of hardware is going nuts. On top of that, We love this stuff. We buy it constantly, and really constantly is the word here, because we have unprecedented rates of obsolescence. Unbelievable. Today's industry brings new upgrades to the market of computers and electronics every 18 months. So if they had their druthers, you would buy a new product every 18 months because it's got all these great new bells and whistles and toyness. They say it's because of rapid innovation, and that's a lot of it. It is rapidly innovating. There's always something new that's awesome. But it's also about planned obsolescence. There's no dollar incentive for creating longevity of product. Not anymore, there isn't. And there's much dollar incentive for rapid planned obsolescence, churning product. And the industry likes to justify this by saying, but it's going to be recycled. Don't worry, just keep burning through there and we'll recycle it. And we'll sell you something new real soon. Don't worry about upgrading it. Don't worry about repairing it. So now the average lifespan of computers is about 2 years. And you think back to our other appliances of our youth. I don't know if you guys are young, old enough, all of you, but a refrigerator used to last like 20-some years. Your toaster would last 20-some years. 2 years is nuts, and it's even getting less than that with cell phones. So it's throwaway design. It's designed for the dump. And there's this great group called iFixit. You might have heard of these guys. You should really check out their website. But they're fighting this tide, and they are showing everybody, whether you're a mechanic or not, how to fix your old computers and stuff, how to fix your Apple products and everything. Lately, they have been getting products that are just unfixable. Lately, the Apple computers and tablets and such, they glue down the battery with such strong glues that you cannot take it out. It was not designed to take out a battery. And this is so the iFixit group is going to be called the I Can't Fix It group unless they can turn this thing around. So products consumed massively and rapidly create massive waste. And this is what I call the mountain. And it's a mountain figuratively, but sometimes literally. But it's growing in every continent and in unprecedented rates. 50 million metric tons every year, according to UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. But that would be just a terrible thing, a mess, if it weren't for the fact that this is toxic. Significant toxicity in this material. So we have the toxic metals, lead, cadmium, mercury. We have the brominated flame retardants, which are persistent organic pollutants. We have other halogenated hydrocarbons create a lot of problems when they're burned, for example. And in their production, they create a lot of pollution. And we have rare earth elements with unknown toxicity in many cases. So that's what's in these machines, in this hardware. So now we have 50 million metric tons of toxic waste. And that is a crisis every year being created. If you want to look at how that scales out, 50 million metric tons is over 1 million metric tons of lead, 3,350 tons of cadmium, which is even more toxic than lead. In the US, our waste in 2009 contained about 143,000 metric tons of lead and 214 metric tons of cadmium. You got to think about scale with this stuff because there's so much of it. A little bit, a lot means a big mess. So when regulators started realizing, oh my God, this stuff is hazardous, it's going to be a problem, it's going into our landfills, the mantra became, let's divert it from the landfill to recycling, of course. And that sounded really, really good. And all of these recyclers, these electronics recyclers became the new job, and shingles were put out everywhere saying we are PC recyclers, we are electronics recyclers, and there are thousands of people calling themselves that now. It's seen even today that this will triple by 2025. It's really a business that people are encouraged to get into. It's growing rapidly, very promising. But what people didn't realize in the beginning, and I hope they're realizing more and more, is that these guys, for the most part, are not recyclers. but they quickly load your old PC, your old TV, your old cell phone into intermodal containers, and they load them up, and they put them onto ships. And those ships go off mostly to Asia, sometimes to Africa. And we still reckon that of what you deliver to recyclers, about 80%, certainly 50 to 80%, is very quickly exported and not recycled domestically. That isn't the whole percentage of all the e-waste stream, but it's what you deliver to a recycler. And those figures are based on anecdotal information because there are no good facts. So what we do is we ask industry people what they believe the figures are, and we get close estimates with some data we have. But if anybody tells you they have definitive data about those numbers, it doesn't exist. So it's an out of sight, out of mind situation. Our old PCs and TVs are in those containers. When I went to Hong Kong with Frontline, we interviewed some brokers on hidden camera. I asked them, how many containers a day do you think is coming into Hong Kong alone? They said 50 to 100 a day. Just one port, one day. So we revealed this dirty little secret of the industry way back in 2002 when we put out our film, Exporting Harm. And I don't know, it sounds like most of you have seen that film, so I will go through these pictures rather quickly. This is a gentleman who's sweeping out toner. That's what he does all day. Out of these cartridges to reuse, and he's breathing in that carbon black material. Woman smashing CRTs to get the copper yoke off the back. The CRT is a cathode ray tube, the typical tube of an old style monitor or TV. And then the glass we found in these irrigation ditches just thrown. Glass is full of lead. Inside the CRTs are deadly phosphors, powder that lights up when the electrons hit it. This is an occupation you'll only see in this part of China called Guiyu, where we went, and it's cooking circuit boards. And thousands of people are employed every day cooking these boards to pull the chips off, that then go to these acid strippers who use very dangerous acids to, and they create toxic gases, and they flush it all right into the river to get the gold out. Very inefficient way to get gold, but they do it. These women sort the wires and burn them at night to get the copper. And when we first did this expose, a lot of these asset tags we would find on the equipment, we would bring back and we would follow up on them. And I gave a bunch of them to the Los Angeles Times because there's a lot of stuff from the the California system of schools, the LA system of schools, medical facilities, etc. The LA Times chased the school system down and they asked the person in charge of getting rid of all this stuff, what did you do? Where'd it go? And she said, in the classic quote, which I'll never forget, I don't know where they went. They went away. So that word away is a very interesting word. So then in 2005, we went to a similar situation, but not exactly the same. Similar in that the same externalization dynamic was driving this stuff offshore, but different in that the marketplace there was all about reuse and not about materials recovery. So they were trying to get what was still working and sell it in the marketplace. But unfortunately, about 75% they admitted, even the people in the market, 75% of what they were receiving was completely unusable even in Africa and unrepairable, even though they have brilliant repair people in the marketplace. So these guys are trying to repair some of these CRTs, but a lot of it was just thrown away. They'd pull the copper off, yeah, but they would just throw it away, and they would burn it in the dumps near Lagos. Every time the dump got full in these wetlands, they would just torch it. I went back to Guiyu 6.5 years later with 60 Minutes, and I was really surprised, this was in 2008, to see that it had gotten far worse. So here's Scott Pelley in shock, and me looking off into the distance. This is just before, if you've seen that video, which is really interesting to look at, it's still online. We got attacked about 3 minutes after this picture was taken by the motorcycle gangs employed by the mayor of the town to get rid of journalists. But what we saw there before we were attacked were these burn houses and massive amounts of e-waste that had piled up in bags. The difference between 6 years ago is 6 years ago they didn't put it in bags, now they were putting it in bags. But the technologies were just as bad, perhaps worse, in that they were burning things indoors where there was no ventilation, very little ventilation, and then they would take the components that were burned, these were like transformers for laptops, and pull the burned stuff out and try to pick out the copper. Acid operations had proliferated even way beyond the river. They've gone inland, and many more of them were taking place. So things had gotten far worse. And after we went there, scientists came in, and one particular woman at Chantal University has done some excellent work. She has found now that 88% of the children she's recently studied have significant lead poisoning in their blood. Lead and children do not mix well. Attention deficit disorders, central nervous system problems, brain damage, etc. Then we went to Accra, Ghana, in West Africa. Again, this particular place is very poignant. You can go there and see it yourself. They're not going to chase you out. It's not of a high scale, but it's very sad because we have orphans doing all this work of burning the imported material. People that are completely disenfranchised from society have no other means of making money are burning in the slums of Accra. So what's wrong with this picture? Again, I would say it's externalization. The fact that we permit a false economics in our midst. We relegate it to the back issues of economy textbooks. We don't face up to it. It really is what's making this world not tick. Creates damage to human health and the environment, creates social injustice. And the hidden costs that we're talking about, just some of them, occupational disease, these are the things that are externalized costs that nobody is going to pay the bill for. Genetic damage, endocrine disruption, how much is that worth? Infant mortality, neurological dysfunction, birth defects, loss of arable land, food contamination, loss of groundwater resources, loss of wildlife, biological diversity. If you go to Guangdong province in China, you'll know what I'm talking about. Loss of clean air. And then the remediation costs, if they're ever paid someday. Let's hope they are someday. So due to the ease of externalization via globalization, developing countries, I would posit, are disproportionately being burdened by pollution from a lot of different sectors of waste. They're getting more globally than we are. And remember, I showed you this picture. Generally, that wasn't a pretty picture of the life cycle and how it's playing out, north to south, south to north. With electronics, it's even a little uglier. These are the different stages of the electronics life cycle. And you have extraction at the very beginning where you're pulling out metals out of the ground. Very, very deadly. This is represented by the skull and crossbones there, if you can see it. It's a large skull and crossbones, shows its environmental impact relatively. Production also very dangerous with electronics. A lot of cancer clusters around. Chip manufacturer places are mostly in Asia now. And then we have the use of the product. And you can see that that's not very dangerous. You don't get a lot of toxic gases coming off your laptop. There's some, but not much. Disassembly. That's where you take the thing apart, also not very dangerous. But then you have the recycling and disposal. Once again, very dangerous. And you will see by this orange line here, the stuff that's really dangerous in the life cycle is happening in the global south. We use it, we disassemble it, all the dirty parts take place in the global south, and that's all because externalization is allowed. So, solutions. Now we get more hopeful, and I'm just going to run by a few of them here, the kind of strategies we've worked on. Obviously, the ultimate solution, as I've said, is to do everything we can to internalize or prevent costs, even better, and so that we can turn this equation around so that the true cost is less than the market price rather than the other way around. That's a real profit. That's not exploitation. So true cost economics can happen via legislation, or it can happen by market strategies. So I'm going to run by examples of those right now. One of the examples, of course, is there ought to be a law. Well, we created a law with the Basel Convention, but the United States didn't go that way. So we are trying right now to create an act called the Responsible Electronics Recycling Act, which implements the Basel ban for electronics. And we feel we've got enough traction now with the 60 Minutes piece and other people starting to get aware of this issue. And moreover, the fact that we have a lot of recycling industry allies now. So the EPA noted that we needed regulation. In 2008, many years after we came out with our expose, they finally realized we have a problem. And the GAO, I said the EPA, I'm sorry, the GAO realized we had a problem and urged the EPA to do something about it. As you can see with this title here, they didn't do much about it. So we're turning to Congress, and we also have to remind people that state bills, even though there's quite a lot of them happening in various states, there's 26 states now, I believe, that have e-waste legislation, none of them can control e-waste exports, and that's because in our Constitution in the United States, we have a Commerce Clause which says only the federal government can control international trade. So it can't be a job for the states. But what the states are doing is they're diverting the material from landfill, and that has the perverse effect of creating more piles that go to recyclers, and therefore more percentage or more actual volumes go offshore. So in the USA, as a nation, we're increasingly diverting the e-waste from our lined, leachate-controlled landfills. I'm not saying landfills is a great thing to do with them, but there's a lot better than what I've seen around the world. And we're sending it off to the rice paddies and the burn dumps of Africa. So that's why it's so important we get this at the federal level. But I don't know if you all realize, but our Congress is not very functional at the moment. So we have done everything we could to make this the most Republican bill you can ever imagine in the House of Representatives, and not even use the word environment, if we can get away with it, just talk about jobs, national security, issues they can relate to. And we're counseled by our lobbyists not even to say green jobs. We have to talk about jobs. And but we've actually done really well. We have more Republican sponsors than we have Democratic sponsors the last time this was introduced, last year. And we think we've got a good shot, even though everyone thinks we're crazy to say that. I think given the hand we're dealt, we're doing better than anybody expected of getting this through. And the reason being primarily is we have made relationships with a lot of recyclers with our work on the market strategy, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we told them, don't work with us, go off and create your own coalition. And they did so. And there's over 70 companies on board now. The largest recycler on the planet, Sims Recycling, is part of this group. They don't want to compete with these exporters anymore either. So they're a huge force. And that's why we think we have a shot. Then we have market strategies. And especially in the United States, where we didn't have legislation, we didn't have the Basel Convention, when we first put out our report, Exporting Harm, we couldn't find one recycler at that time, in 2002, that was not exporting something that was hazardous. Not one. So we had to go to them. In the course of a year, we started talking to them and said, are you willing to stand up for this issue and be part of a group which we will try to send customers to? And we got the e-Stewards program going at that time, and it has grown into a full-scale certification. So we now have third-party auditors go out, check the books, check the companies, make sure they're doing the right thing, not exporting their e-waste, not throwing it in landfills, not using prison labor, et cetera. And then they get a certification. And we try to send the market to them. It's all based on this standard here, which you can download a version of it, which is integrated with ISO 14001, and it's all very official, and the standard is now going global. We also have an enterprise program, which again, we're saying we're trying to drive the market to them. These are the big business customers of recyclers. They all have massive amounts of e-waste of their own. We've got these large companies to agree to always favor e-stewards and use best efforts to always use e-stewards recyclers. And these guys are not just doing a greenwash, even though we don't audit them, they have to report to us every year how their progress is going. They have to put in all our RFPs that e-stewards are preferred. RFPs are requests for proposals of disposition of their waste. You can find these e-stewards all over the US by going to our website, e-stewards.org. So I want to talk about one more market solution, which is the best buy is the green buy. When I showed you that deadly life spiral of electronics, I left out probably the most important phase, and that is design. The design stage is really where externalities are planned or not. This is where you can make a huge difference. Do we put toxic stuff in there? It's a little cheaper. We don't have to ever pay for it. So why not? This is where the rubber hits the road with design. So you can play a role in that as a consumer, voting with your pocketbook. This is the eco-label we'd love to see everywhere. Wouldn't it be nice if when I was in China I would see that on equipment, I would know that at least it wasn't poisoning anybody, but I never saw that label. But there are ways now, there are a tremendous number of report cards that are being created to help consumers that want to take a little extra time to figure out which products to buy. These are some of them. This is the Greenpeace report card to Greener Electronics. This is EPEAT, which is a EPA invented this tool. It's received a lot of criticism, but the idea behind it is sound. It's a little bit compromised because industry is really behind it and they water down the standards. But it's amazing how influential this is to driving the market. And so you look at EPEAT and you can actually plug in what type of equipment you want, and you get the gold, silver, bronze products in their actual brands and model numbers. So that's epeat.net. And then the Electronics Take Back Coalition, which we're part of, has their own recycling report card on the manufacturers and how well they're doing on taking back their own equipment voluntarily. So the lesson, again, is the pollution follows the path of greatest cost externalization. Our global economic rules institutionalize cost externalization. It equals damage to human health and the environment. It equals social injustice. But there are solutions, and you just have to take a little bit more time to follow those solutions. I want to close by reading you a paragraph I wrote for this book. This book is called Permanent Error. It's done by an African photographer who took some of the shots you saw in the section I showed you on Ghana, the square format shots were so poignant. And he has a book on that, and he wanted me to write for it. And harking back to that statement by the Los Angeles school district official who said they went away, I wrote this. Wherever we live, we must realize that when we sweep things out of our lives and throw them away, they don't ever disappear as we might like to believe. There is no magic away, though there are many tricks. We must know that away is in fact a place here on earth. In a world where cost externalization and harm is made all too easy by the pathways of globalization, Away is likely to be somewhere where people are impoverished, powerless, and too desperate to be able to resist poison for the realities of their poverty. Unless we are mindful, away could be a place where people suffer for our ignorance or indifference. Or it could be a place where people take great care to prevent wastefulness, or where they treat our waste like gold. But away is always a place. It is a place of our choosing. Thank you very much. So, do we have any questions? Yes.
I'm assuming that there are a lot of like underdeveloped areas, like the ones you're talking about, where the people are financially dependent on the taking apart materials and things like that. I'm just wondering, as we move towards stopping the export of e-waste, what are their options?
That's a really good question. That's what the 60 Minutes guy asked me, of course, if you watch that video. And we really looked at this in China, for example, because people saying they're going to starve to death if you carry on with your campaign. We proved beyond a shadow of doubt that that was not true. But they are dependent in a way, for sure. And the way is that those former farmers in China that come into Guangdong province and do these jobs, they still live back at home, and they go back for the New Year's, etc. They can only subsist. So they're not going to starve, but they cannot buy things. They cannot get a television. They can't get cash. It's the only way they can do it is with these kind of jobs. But there are so many jobs that they're doing in Guangdong province that aren't killing them. And they may be menial, and we've seen a lot of people in cottage industries making shoes, for example. There's so many ways that we could give them cleaner jobs if we really cared about that issue. So I would posit that desperate people do desperate things, and we should not be aiding and abetting that desperation. We should not be giving them a choice between poverty and poison. There are other choices. And I think that's our role to play. So I hope that answered your question. But it is a real issue. Yeah.
Is HR 2284 on the current Congress's docket, and is there a Senate version of it?
It's not this year yet. So I will watch for it. We're still waiting for the precise moment. But last year it was there on the docket, got some debate. We have some difficulties with the sub-chair of one of the committees. There's only one group that's against this bill that we can find, and that's a group called Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries, and they're very powerful. And that's our biggest hurdle right now, is getting this stuff heard in committee. In the Senate side, it's not so dire, but in the House of Representatives, we have to really be forceful to get it even heard. But it'll come up again soon.
Could you tell us a bit more about what is in the bill?
Oh, it's really simple. Simple to describe in broad terms. It takes the Basel definitions of hazardous waste, applies them to electronics. So what's really hazardous are CRTs, circuit boards, any mercury lamps, batteries, some batteries that have mercury, cadmium, and lead in them. Those things are considered hazardous waste. Not all electronics. If you do this disassembly and put the copper one place, steel one place, that's not going to be barred from export. So only a hazardous waste by Basel definitions, and then it says you can't export those to non-Annex 7 countries. We don't use Annex 7, but we say EU, OECD, and Liechtenstein. If you're not in that group, you can't receive it. So it's based on the Basel Convention precisely, the Basel Ban Amendment, I should say, but only for electronics. We're not taking on the whole gamut of hazardous waste. Yeah.
You might have just started to answer this, but when you got to the solution, you mentioned this bill, I got really excited. And then when you mentioned that it was written in a very Republican-friendly way, I don't mean to offend anyone, I couldn't help but think back to what you said about
Well, not now it isn't, even though we're advertising it in the way you described. So, politics is what it is right now. But what we fear, of course, is what they call the sausage machine of Congress, where it'll start getting amended and compromised, so you don't even recognize it anymore, and then we might have to kill our own babies. So that's the sad truth of how legislation sometimes works. The good news I mentioned to you, we got all those recyclers on board, but we also got the retailers and some of the biggest OEM manufacturers of electronics. We got HP, Dell behind it, Best Buy's behind it. So that speaks volumes to the congressman. We only have that one very entrenched lobby group, ISRI, that's against it. Yeah.
Is there a way a college campus could form a relationship with eSports enterprises?
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked, because the enterprise program is open to institutions and nonprofits and cities. And we have the University of Washington, for example. We have great dreams of having a whole university program to roll out, but we haven't had the capacity to do it yet. But it's a natural. If somebody wanted to take the leadership to organizing universities, we have the ideas of how to do it. We have an ambassador program for each university that wants to do it. And it would be a twofold goal: to get your own university to make sure it always uses eStewards, but also to spread the word to all the students about what to do with their own electronics. So, a lot of times the school year cuts down and the dorms are full of stuff, and kids don't know what to do with it either. So that's the goal of it, to spread the awareness among the students, but also in the university itself. For example, Connecticut College, find out what you're doing with your electronics. Make sure you're using an eStewards, and we can make you an enterprise, put out the press release, drum roll, and everything. So we'd love to do that. Yes. Oh, I just thought I saw your hand. Any more questions? Going. All right, well, thank you all very, very much.